Hello everyone, welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators, in which Laura McWilliams will discuss important questions relating to gender in language teacher education. My name is Shirin Soyoz and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. This is the second in our new series of monthly webinars for teacher educators, and you can register for the future sessions from our Teaching English website. Before we start the session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. While waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service, type in-service in the Q&A. We had some pre-webinar activities. In one of these activities, we asked you a question, and the question was, how can teacher educators help teachers discover more gender-neutral words? Thanks for your contributions. If you would like to see the suggestions that other teacher educators shared, or if you would like to contribute, we'll share the link with you later in the chat. We also had a poll, and Laura will share the results with you during the session. And this session is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. Finally, you will have a chance to ask questions during this session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenter your questions. So let me introduce you to our guest today. Laura McWilliams is the head of Young Learners for the British Council for the Middle East and Africa region. She's a highly experienced teacher educator. She has specific expertise in promoting gender equality in English language teaching through her work in supporting teachers. She presents regularly at national and international conferences and volunteers on the IETFL Young Learners and Teenagers Special Interest Group. Laura, over to you to launch today's session.
Thank you, Sirin. Am I okay to share my screen now?
Yes, please.
Great, I'll do that now. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it, Laura.
Fantastic. I'll start then. So I wanted to start by introducing myself a little bit. Sirin gave me a bit of an introduction, but it made me sound very serious. And I am just a person, and I'm going to be honest and tell you I'm nervous about this session. But I am excited as well. I love talking about these kind of issues, and I think they're really important. As Sirin said, I'm currently living in Egypt, and I can see in the chat that we have some others in Egypt as well, so a special hello to them. I'm going to share something a little bit more fun about myself, so you feel like you know me, and I can tell you that I'm obsessed with pandas. And there's something else. I'm trying to set an example, and I'm just going to highlight something on the screen that tells you something about me. And we're going to come back later to talk about your ideas why I may have done this and what the purpose of doing this in this way was. Okay, so now that you know a bit about me, let's get started. Today's session is all about gender in teacher education. And so the first thing I'd like to ask you is where you think gender fits into the British Council's CPD framework for teacher educators. I hope you're all familiar with the framework, but if not, you can see on the slide in front of us that that framework lists 11 different professional practices under the headings of knowledge, skills, and approaches to development. So which of these professional practices for us teacher educators do you think gender is relevant to? Maybe if you type your answers in the Q&A and we can see what you all think. Very interested to see. Gosh, the Q&A is busy already. So do you think it's related to understanding educational contexts or contributing to the profession? What do you think? Yes, it is related. To anything in particular, Sarah Thwathley, you're agreeing to skills? Somebody saying, oh, Helen, you're my winner today because you've given the answer I was hoping somebody would say. which is all of them. Yes, exactly. Gender is absolutely related to any and all of the skills because it is something that is continuously around us and something that we all need to develop our awareness of. However, I have decided today to focus on one of these particular professional practices more specifically, and that one is actually going to be adopting inclusive practices. So here is the sort of definition from the CPD framework. You'll see there's a link to the framework on the screen if you're not familiar with it, and we will share all of these links with the PowerPoint after the session. So don't worry, you'll be able to go back and explore the framework in more detail if you're not familiar with it already. So why have I chosen adopting inclusive practices as my sort of main thrust today? Well, because inclusion is the beginning of everything. You know, it's until we've achieved an inclusive classroom, the learning that can take place in it is limited. And until we've achieved an inclusive training room, the development that can take place in it is limited. So for me, inclusion is always the starting point before we can do anything in any kind of detail. So this is where I'm starting. I also think that it's something that if you're dealing with teachers who may be resistant to talking about the topic of gender and inclusivity, you know, who may find it culturally challenging, starting with the fact that we want everyone to feel welcome and included is hard to argue with. So it can be a great way to lead into it with teachers who are less familiar with these kind of topics. If you start with inclusion, the more explicit explorations of gender can come as teachers are ready. You know, we have to meet teachers where they are and take them forward in increments, okay? So in teacher development sessions, you know, when you start to talk about gender, teachers often begin to reflect on personal experiences. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. And they also will talk about their professional beliefs, and we're going to do a little bit of that. The aim, therefore, for today's session is to equip teacher educators with some tools that we ourselves can use to assess and improve gender inclusivity in the training room and in our own practices, and hopefully that our trainees can take from us and reflect in their teaching practice. So we're trying to create a kind of positive cycle. Okay, I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's what you've come here looking for. All right, so let's start with a definition of gender inequality. There's lots of them. You know, people have written books on this topic. This is a very, very simple definition, but the reason I've chosen it is because of that last line. I want to make it really, really clear that anyone can experience gender-based inequality or discrimination. Some genders are more likely than others. However, it is, and I think we need to really remember that throughout the whole session, something that can apply to anybody. Okay, so as Cyril mentioned earlier, before the session, you guys all had the opportunity to do a little online poll, and I want to start by sharing some of those results because they were fascinating. So one of the things we asked you to do was to say true or false to a statement: men are smarter than women. And this one I was very relieved to see the result for, although I'm quite intrigued who those 80% of men are. Maybe have a little chat with them later. However, what was interesting was the next statement. Men are better at maths. Now, if only 8% of people think that men are smarter than women, why do 40% think they're better at maths? I thought this was interesting. I think when we see the phrase men are smarter than women, we don't want to say that that's false, but then when we start to dig a bit, maybe some more hidden beliefs come out. So let's carry on and look at some more results. Women are more loving and caring than men, and we had a majority thinking that was true. But women are better at languages was completely 50-50. It was very interesting. Why do you think we put these statements in the pre-session poll? Where do you think we're going? What do you think this could, why do you think these are important when we think about our role as teacher educators? Any ideas? Pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Why might we have used these statements? How are they connected to our roles as teacher educators? Nicholas, I love your statement. We're going to crush these stereotypes. I hope so. Stereotypes in the classroom, very interesting, Elisa. So not just how we view our trainees, but we view our learners, maybe. Yeah, showing our biases, Susan. We all have them, absolutely. Maybe to know which gender is better at teaching. Interesting. Women are more sensible. Oh, well, I don't know. Are we? I know I'm not always sensible. Caitlin, I'm thinking about these statements influences how we teach, for sure. Lalia, to have an idea about our attitudes. Yes. Okay. So, these statements are really important because look at the next two. They lead into the next two. Women make better teachers for early years and primary students. 73% of people agreed. That shocked me. And men make better leaders. That one, I'm very pleased to see that 70% of people disagreed. Or at least 70% of the people that answered the poll. So this, I think, when we think about ourselves as teacher educators, has a real potential impact on how we deal with our trainees. If we go into dealing with trainees with the assumption, maybe we don't realize it, I'm not saying that we're, this is conscious or deliberate, but if we go into those dealing with trainees with the assumption that the female trainees are more suited to teaching the younger students, do we, without perhaps meaning to, encourage them in a certain direction? Do we judge their teaching differently? When it comes to encouraging people to pursue promotion or supporting people to plan their continuing professional development, do we perhaps think that, well, it's a man, let's encourage him to go for the promotion sooner? And I think it happens. There's a lot of research about this. So, for example, in the UK, there's been a recent report from, well, I say recent, 2020, talking about how soon people become head teachers. And female teachers are significantly less likely to become head teachers than men. Even though female teachers make up 85% of the teaching workforce, it's actually a lot smaller percentage of management. It's really very interesting. Men are also likely to be promoted to head teacher much younger. And if we're thinking about intersectionality, the figures for women of colour or from other minority ethnic backgrounds, so Latinas, etc., face even more barriers. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have to assess our unconscious biases. We all have them. It is normal. Don't beat yourself up about it. I have mine. For instance, literally just before the webinar began and the organisers and I were chatting, I discovered that one of them is from Manchester, which is the same town that I'm from, and that had an impact. I recognised that I suddenly felt more friendly or I felt a connection. It's natural, it's normal, but we need to then make an active effort to assess the privileges and biases that we have to really recognise them. We need to be a little bit introspective. We need to allow ourselves to be critical of ourselves. And we then need to take the next step, which is thinking about those biases and how they impact our professional practice, whether that's in the materials that we make for our training sessions, whether it's in the language we use, whether it's how we interact with people. And once we've recognised that impact, obviously the next thing we need to do is to try and modify our behaviour. Okay, so what I'd like to try and do is do a little activity with you guys. Now, you may have heard the phrase, check your privilege. So it's said a lot on social media. Now, there are serious ways we can check our privilege. There are lots of online tools to help us explore our unconscious bias. There's some great ones provided by Harvard University, for example. But obviously in a webinar, we don't have time to do all that. I thought I'd start with just one that you could do in a training session with your trainees to help them encourage their biases, but we can also do ourselves to explore ours. And this is an activity based on a TikTok trend. Any TikTok fans in the audience? And it's called the Put a Finger Down Challenge. I'll share a link that tells you more about it later, but this is a trend that went viral in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was absolutely fantastic. The idea was you duet the TikTok videos and react to some statements. So I thought we'd try it together. I know you haven't got your cameras on, but I'm going to ask you to do it, all right? I'd like you to put 10 fingers up like this, okay? And every time I say a sentence that is true for you, put one of your fingers down. And at the end, we'll share how many fingers we have left. Okay, so 10 fingers up. And listen to my statements. If they're true, one finger goes down. You all ready? Okay, I'm going to read these. So statement number 1. When I was a child, I was limited or forbidden from playing certain games because of my gender. I'm going to put one finger down because I wasn't allowed to play cricket. When I went to school, I was rarely, if ever, given pedagogical and curricular materials about members of my own gender and sexual orientation. Number 3, when I was choosing my profession, I could not be sure that my decision to have children wouldn't lower my chances of getting the job I wanted. Number 4, I can't make personal and professional choices without people making comments about my biological clock ticking. Number 5, I find it hard to walk alone through the streets where I live without fear, especially at night. I think some of you must have lost some fingers by now. Let's try number 6. If I drive or park my car badly, people often comment I've done this because of my gender. Number 7, when I speak in public, I'm often perceived as speaking on behalf of my entire gender or my sexual orientation. Number 8, in professional meetings, I often feel out of place, unheard, or even expected to make coffee. Number 9, as a leader or manager, I'm not always taken seriously or treated with respect, and my gender or my sexual orientation plays a role in this. Number 10, if I point out sexism or homophobia, I'm often accused of being self-interested or seeking personal gain, or referred to as irrational or emotional. And the last one, number 11, if you have any fingers left, I feel the media objectify and sexualize my gender. Okay, if anybody's willing to share in the Q&A how many fingers they have left, I'd be really interested to see. Okay, so some people, just one, Julia. Carla, out of fingers. Absolutely, exactly. So that's really brave that you're sharing this. Thank you. When this goes on TikTok, it's really interesting. They had a lot of couples doing it, mixed gender couples, and the male partner would have many more fingers than the female every time. And it was absolutely fascinating. This is an activity you can do with your trainees as a jumping off point to get them to start thinking about it, to get them to recognize privileges that they have and assumptions they've made. It can be quite revealing. You can also get them to do it secretly, to put their hands underneath the table if they're not comfortable sharing. I've also done this with classes. I've done this with classes of teenagers, and it's fascinating as well. So this is an activity that your trainees can take and replicate in their own teaching practice. The statements I used today were from a report, a SAGE report, and the link to that is on the screen, but again, will be in the handout later, and I will share another link about the actual TikTok challenge, so you can go and watch some of the videos and use them if they help. Do you think you could use that one in your teaching room? Do you think it would be helpful? I think it's a very, very powerful tool. Okay, so we've done a little bit of analysing our assumptions and thinking about where we're starting. So the three things I said we needed to then think about how this could impact our practice were interaction patterns, language, and materials. Oh, let's start with interaction patterns. So before I reveal anything, how do you think gender bias in any direction, affecting any gender, might have a real impact in the classroom? How might we see it in the classroom? What do you think this could actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Suggestions, just waiting for the Q&A to catch up. You're all saying so much, it's fascinating. I will go back later and read everything, I promise. Yes, Amira, they absolutely impact how we look at the students. Okay, so do you think that our assumptions make us treat different genders differently? Okay, interesting. Some really great suggestions coming through, guys. Okay, so let me share some research results for you. So, remember, I'm thinking about interaction patterns here. So there was a piece of research, actually there's been a lot of research done on interaction patterns and how different teachers respond to different genders in the classroom. But these are some results from a piece of work that was done back in 1994. It's well worth reading this if you get the chance. And so the researchers analysed videotapes and they found some 6 quite crucial facts. That teachers interact more with boys and girls, and boys receive both more praise and more criticism. I think that's very interesting. They notice that boys are more likely than girls to call out, to shout out, even when we haven't been nominated. Teachers are stricter with boys, or not, if they're getting more criticism, but they're not actually correcting the behaviour. Very interesting. So all of these facts have an impact, and this research was done with young learners, but I'd be very interested, in my opinion, I think we carry this over if we're in the adult classroom or the training room. Now, as I said, there's been a lot of literature on this topic. There hasn't been as much from sort of some of the countries like Egypt, where I am, or some of the Latin American countries. A lot of it is quite American or Western. I'd be very interested to read more research from other countries. There are some other points of view. There's another great piece of research from Beeman, Wheeler and Kemp that postulates the idea that SEN is a big factor in teacher attention, and that boys tend to have more declared SENs. It's a significant contributing factor, and I think that's something else that's very interesting to explore. Again, that intersectionality of gender and educational, special educational needs is really interesting. So, knowing this, knowing these facts, could they impact our practice? And I have some tools that I'd like to suggest we look at. So, observation is a really crucial tool. We can introspect all we like, but sometimes having somebody from the outside is very useful as well. So some of you may recognise this drawing, this illustration. It's from Parrott's Tasks for Language Teachers, which is an absolute classic in any training library. So this is a task he suggests, an observation task he suggests, where the observer draws a map of the classroom, showing where each student sits, and every time there's an interaction, the observer draws a line between the people interacting. So, you know, you can see in this example that, you know, student 14 and 15 are talking a lot, The teacher has never directly interacted with student 15. It's quite revealing. The task provides the teacher with an objective record of the amount of attention they're giving individual students and the balance of different focuses, so teacher-student and student-student, etc. And it's a really great source for reflection. Now, I think you could adapt this to look at or to focus on gender. I think that you could draw this map with an indication of student gender and then use this to reflect on the reality of your interactions in the classroom. It can also be made more sophisticated. You could have different coloured lines for praise or criticism, for example. And I would strongly suggest that you have a trusted friend observe you as a trainer to really give yourself some feedback on how you're interacting with your trainees. I think it's a super useful. You have to be a bit brave, but I think it's a super useful tool, okay? And of course, it's a tool we can then give to our trainees to use in their own practice. I think, you know, a lot of us use peer observations as developmental tools for teachers that we work with, and this is something that they could definitely replicate and use. It's a very simple tool, it's very easy, but the reflection that comes out of it is very rich. Has anyone done this task before? Do any of you know it from the Parrot book? If you don't have a trusted friend available, you can do it with recordings. Obviously, you would need permission for that, especially if you're working with young learners. Okay, so this is an observation task that very specifically focuses on gender, if that's how you're using it. But gender doesn't always have to be the only focus. You know, sometimes when we start to work with teachers and talk about gender, we have to take more incremental steps, and it can be quite difficult for a teacher to realise, or quite difficult for a teacher to sort of take on gender as such a huge focus. So you can also just include it as one criteria among many in an observation task. So this is a task from another great book that I recommend, Classroom Observation Tasks. And it's actually a task that focuses on tasks. So it's an observation tool that focuses on classroom tasks. And what you could notice here is that gender if you're giving your teachers guidance on how to complete these peer observations, you can include gender as just one aspect, starting to acclimatise them to thinking about it. And I would suggest that the area here, that is, might be setting, social arrangements in which the task is carried out. Possibly also teacher and learner role. Okay, so that leads into something I'd like to say, which is consideration for use of the physical space. So the UNICEF publication, you'll see the link on the slide, and again, we'll share it later. It's a great publication, I recommend it. And there is a section where it talks about the physical space and how that can support gender equity. And it has some questions for us to ask. And I suggest that we could apply these questions to set up the training rooms. Okay, does our training room setup mimic the setup our teachers are able to use in their classrooms? Does it encourage them to think about how to set up their classrooms? Obviously, this is going to be very context specific. Sometimes we have teachers who are, you know, in a system where the classrooms are set up all in rows and they don't have an impact. But there are suggestions we can make for them. You know, even if you have rows and you can't move the desks, you can rotate who sits at the front, who sits at the back. There are lots and lots of things we can do. You know, if you can change the desks, that's great. But we need to think about our training room and make sure that we are presenting a model for the teachers that we're supporting. In addition to being a model, we can also ask our trainees to work on activities for analysing this more specifically. So I have a suggestion, which is a layout analysis activity. And I'm sure you've all done These, maybe if you're delivering a CELTA, this is definitely a classic session in the CELTA. I remember it from mine many years ago. And what you could do, what I do when I do this, is I would have my trainees working in groups, and I would give each of them a layout, a different classroom layout. So for example, you've got the table rows on the screen, and I would give them some prompt questions and ask them to complete a pro and con chart for that particular layout. Once all my groups had finished, I'd get them to put the pro and con charts on the wall. We'd do a gallery tour where they looked at the different layouts. They thought about, what their opinions were, what they agreed and disagreed with. Very simple activity to do in the training room. But you can slide in gender in there. So and that's through careful use of prompt questions, including a prompt question. Does it promote equal participation of all genders? And thinking about, diversity and equality is never one issue alone. Let's throw in disability there, for example. Let's potentially ask a question about SEN in there. So thinking about the prompt questions you use, again, it's just starting to bring gender into the equation every time we do something with our trainees. Okay. There's a link again we'll share later that has lots of pictures of nice layouts that you can use. So the last thing that I'd like to there's the link in fact. The last thing I'd like to talk about when it comes on the topic of interaction is ways to encourage full participation in training sessions and also in the classroom. Oops. Sorry, going too fast there, let me go back. So could you in the Q&A pop in what techniques you encourage your trainees to practice and learn to ensure full participation? Let's have a look. What have we got? Oh, sorry, my screen went a bit bonkers. It's supposed to be. Just scrolling to see what people are saying. Okay, so some suggestions there, very interesting. Someone there's talking about the traditional pair check. Obviously, it's a classic technique. Okay, so these are the six first techniques that came to my mind. Anonymous contributions, nowadays that can be done very easily. There's apps, there's an app called Nearpod you could try for that. Equity sticks are when you have, little sticks with each trainee's name on it. You just pull one at random, so everybody gets the and it doesn't go back in the pot until everyone else has answered a question. Hand signals so that everybody answers, thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false. Use of a talking stick. I actually, with my young learners, or when I'm training teachers of young learners, I don't use a talking stick, I use a cuddly toy. It's usually a panda, because I am obsessed with pandas. So I think it's really important as trainees that we practice what we preach, that we make sure that we ourselves are modelling and using all of these techniques in the classroom, in the training room, to encourage our trainees to then go on and use them in the classroom. They are simply good teaching techniques, but by making sure we use them, we're having a beneficial impact on gender equity in the training room and the classroom. All right, we're going to take a little moment here to do a quick catch up on the Q&A, simply because if we wait to the end, we're going to have lost some of these questions. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I think Sirin is going to come back and join us, so we can have a look at the Q&As.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So many comments.
Yes, thank you so much. Your inputs and insights have been really invaluable. We also had a gender survey, and your comments, your slides echoed the opinions of the majority of the respondents. So the results of our survey revealed that it's an important area. Teacher educators are not confident about it, and there is not enough support for gender equality in teacher development. So now we are opening the floor for the first Q&A, and please share your questions in the Q&A. So we already have some questions, and we want to start with Humaira's question. So girls are hesitant about asking questions. Do you think this is true for female trainees, for groups of teacher educators? Are female trainers hesitant about asking questions in the teacher development courses or sessions?
I think they can be, absolutely. Obviously, this can also be influenced by culture, but there are certainly, you know, I've often found that at the end of a training session, female trainees will come up and ask me questions more than men will. Men are usually, in my experience, not exclusively, but I found that the trend is that men are more willing to ask the questions openly in the session, but women will come up and ask me afterwards and often say, oh, you know, I didn't want to ask this during the session. I didn't want to interrupt and ask this. You know, they use a lot of hedging and apologizing. So I think it is a trend. That doesn't mean it's true for everyone. We have to remember when we're talking about things like this to be careful not to stereotype. But yeah, I found that to be a little bit of a trend.
Yeah, we need to consider all of these, right, in our planning. And about Helen asked a question about separating gender. So in the classroom, boys and girls not working together. What are your thoughts on separating teachers according to gender while they're in the training?
If you're in a culture where that's required, obviously you have to respect local culture and what people are comfortable with. So I work in Egypt and mixed gender is fine, but I have had situations where if I'm waiting in the training room or in the classroom and a female student arrives, she'll come in, but if a male student arrives, he won't enter the classroom until somebody else is there as well, so he's not alone with me. So it's about being respectful of what people are comfortable with, but working with them to try and promote that comfort. So if the atmosphere is inclusive, if they are confident they will be respected and able to participate, I think it's achievable, but it may take a little bit of work.
Thank you so much, Laura. We'll have another Q&A at the end of the session. So I'd like to encourage our participants to write their questions in the chat. So yeah, let's move on then.
Okay, let's move on then, definitely. Great. Can you see my screen again?
Yes, yes, we
Perfect.
can.
Okay, so after interaction patterns, the next thing I'd like to talk about is language. And as language teachers, I'm sure we all know that language matters. So we're going to start with just a couple of definitions because I will use some of these terms. So gender sensitive language and gender discriminatory language. So gender sensitive language is, I'd like to think, what we're all aiming for. Okay. Gender discriminatory language is what we're all hopefully trying to avoid. Okay. But I like gender discriminatory language as a term because there is also the term sexist language. Now, essentially, in some ways, you might say that sexist language and gender discriminatory language are the same thing. The same sentence, the same wording, etc. However, there is a difference in how we use those terms. So when we talk about sexist language, we're normally talking about language where the speaker really intended to be sexist. The speaker intended to prioritize one gender over another, and they knew it was disrespectful. It's a question of intent. So I like to be optimistic. I like to try and assume the best. So I do prefer to use the phrase gender discriminatory language when I'm talking about these kind of issues with my trainees. If I want to raise that something they've said is something I might want to reconsider or look at. The phrase gender discriminatory language is much less emotive, and it's a great way into being able to discuss these issues a little bit more. So yeah, just sort of mention that. So I'm going to give you some examples of some sentences, and let's see if we can match them up to these different terms. Okay, these are from a Europa publication called Gender Sensitive Communication. It's a really useful publication. Again, we'll share the link later. So before I show the answers, just maybe have a think, which one do you think connects with which and why? Just take a moment, have a look. If you want to share any suggestions you have, let me know. What do you think? So ambassadors and their wives are invited to attend an after dinner reception. Which one do you think that might be? Okay, well, I'm going to call that gender discriminatory language. There's a clear stereotype here that ambassadors are men that have wives that follow along after them. It doesn't therefore allow for the genders to be equal in value, but the intent probably wasn't to be hurtful. I don't think it's deliberately sexist. It's just a little bit thoughtless, maybe indicative of an unconscious bias. So people do not fully appreciate the impact they have on the environment. I'm hoping that you've all said that was gender neutral. All of the genders are fully included. The gender hasn't got an impact on the sentence or the concepts. The next one though, women must earn less than men because they're less intelligent. That's definitely gender discriminatory, but I would argue that whoever said that had the intent to be sexist. And then the last one, every day, each citizen must ask himself how he can fulfill his civic duties. This isn't necessarily gender discriminatory explicitly. It's more gender bias, which is kind of a subset of gender discriminatory, because it's just using that pronoun he. And actually the person writing it probably wasn't specifically thinking just of men, but they've used he as the default pronoun for everyone. So it's a sort of a subset of that gender discrimination. So we're going to look at some examples of these sentences and how we might want to work with them. So I'm going to start with a question, which is when you're talking to your trainees, how do you refer to them? Do you say, right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get the session started? I mean, guilty, I have said that. I sometimes do still say it if I don't catch myself, because, you know, I grew up saying it. It's just how we say things. What's the problem with it? It's exclusionary because not everybody is a lady or a gentleman, and it also makes gender the focus. Does it matter that we have different genders in our training room? There's no relevance. So do you have anything else that you say? What phrases might you use instead of lady? Hello everyone, dear audience, I like that one. Oh, sunflowers, Susanna, I'm stealing that one. It's beautifully positive. Participants, yes. Simple one, although I find it quite strange to say participants. I find that I might say that in writing. Well, here are some suggestions I've got, the ones I use. I used to use guys, and I've stopped using that because actually I'm not a guy. These are some of the ones I like to say. I like to say panda people. It's just a bit fun, it's personalised. Again, it's kind of creating that fun atmosphere. Sometimes I just go, right, teachers. Let's focus them on their professional selves, their teachers. Beautiful humans, I think, is a lovely positive one. It's a bit like the sunflower suggestion. If you're feeling Shakespearean, gentles all. Why not? It's fun. Friends and folks is a nice one to use. I think that works well because we want to almost do two, you know, ladies and gentlemen, friends and folks. It has the rhythm that can fit our natural speech. I think we need to set an example with our trainees of making sure that we are being gender neutral. And this is one of the reasons I believe you did a Padlet before the session to share some ideas for gender neutral language. So, okay, great, we can model this. How can we encourage our trainees to think about things like this? So again, I have an activity suggestion now, and I am suggesting why not try an alphabet challenge with them. I'm sure you're all familiar with alphabet challenges as a classroom activity. Here are some examples from Activity Village where, you know, students work individually or in groups. I always prefer groups, to come up with one word on a topic for each letter of the alphabet. Well, why not do this with your trainees and get them to come up with a way of referring to their students for each letter of the alphabet? I think it's great, it's fun, it's a lively activity. They're going to come up with lots of ideas. And obviously it's great to demonstrate an activity your teachers can take away and use with other lexical sets in the classroom. There's double value. I would recommend giving your trainees some guidance tips, things like using envisioning language. Envisioning language, if you've not come across the term before, is language that helps learners envisage themselves in a positive way. So scholars, scientists, if you're teaching a science class, learners, problem solvers. These are all really great ways for learners to kind of put themselves in that kind of mindset of seeing themselves as successful. And by just, giving the tip that it should be inclusive, should suggestions come up that aren't gender discriminatory, it allows you to explore that. I'd also suggest that we avoid the overly cute with young learners. I don't like to call them kiddies or little duckies or, those kind of terms, because I think that they infantilize the children, and that's not what we're looking for. And I also, I've heard this a lot. So, Mrs. McWilliams' class, and that's very teacher-centred rather than learner-centred. So again, that's something I would recommend encouraging trainees to avoid. But this is a very simple activity that you can do in the training room that works on several things at once and can really open up a topic. So the next thing I'd like to look at, these are some sentences I have found in various training books, training manuals, or websites talking about teacher training. And I would argue that all of these sentences are ones that as trainers, we would want to try and rephrase if we found ourselves writing or saying them. What's the problem in any of these sentences? Can anybody recognise it? The more professional the teacher is, the more autonomy he demands and is given. So, yes, it's the he. Teachers don't have to be he's, okay? The next one, teachers are the middlemen. Yes, somebody's already said middlemen. Yes, teachers are the connection between parents and their children. Teachers are the fulcrum between parents and their children. There's so many ways you could have said that didn't involve middlemen. The next one, rather than seeing themselves solely as masters of subject matter. Again, master is a male oriented word, and its female equivalent mistress has very different connotations. So thinking about that as well. Other examples of words that we would use that have a clear connotation are words like the adjective bossy, which very rarely gets applied to men. And again, the last one, we also have the his. So there are a couple of articles on the Teaching English website that I recommend for this. If you want to sort of look at this, there's one on non-gendered language and how to teach it. We'll share those links later for further reading. So we need to look at our own language. How can we help our trainees look at theirs? So I'd like to suggest an activity for this. And then this is an activity that I have shamelessly stolen from Gemma Pryor, who presented a version of this in a webinar she did for the British Council a few years ago on non-gendered language. And I've adapted it for teacher training rather than in the classroom. I recommend that webinar, it's really great. So, possible activity. So maybe you're doing a session with your trainees on discussion activities, and so you're demoing a discussion activity, and we're going to slide in a little bit of gender awareness into that. So we're going to start with, we're going to elicit some vocab from our trainees as if they were students. We're modelling this, and we'd ask them, okay, what do you call a person who teaches at university? They're going to come up with professor. What about someone who attends university, maybe undergraduate, a student, postgraduate, somebody who has children as a parent? So we've got 3 terms here. Okay, now we're going to give them a scenario that involves these 3 people. They're going to discuss it and ask them to come to a decision on what the person should do. And here's the scenario: students failing, parent calls the university demanding to speak to the professor, very angry, how dare you fail my child? What should the professor do? The trainees, pretending to be learners, would discuss it. Obviously, you would demonstrate the scaffolding and support that they would do if they were doing this in the classroom. You'll find that when they report back, the genders tend to be masculine. These are examples, we think the professor should refuse to speak to the parent because the student is an adult. No gender in that one, but maybe the professor could consult his colleagues for advice. He should refuse to speak to the parent until he is more respectful. And this, again, is for various reasons. When I've done this activity before, the professor is almost always male. The student could be either. The parent is more likely to be female, actually, in the responses I get back. And I think it's very interesting to unpack why that might be. Do we associate professorship with masculinity for some reason? Okay, so what you can then do is show them a picture of the people where the professor happens to be a woman. And if you've got 2 minutes later, go and Google female professor and you will be shocked at some of those images that come up. It's actually quite hard. It took me a while to find this one. I was delighted with it. Showing that picture immediately challenges their assumptions and can lead in to a discussion about why they've made those assumptions. And you can then follow that up with language, a couple of grammatically correct sentences, and ask students which they prefer, what they think the difference might be, what alternatives can they offer. This is where you can start to bring in your singular they, if you want to talk about it. And it's a language-focused discussion. Your students can take this activity that you've demonstrated and replicate it in the classroom, not necessarily with professors or students. But I like it because not only are they having discussions about their role as teachers, what should a teacher do in this situation, but they're also starting to think about language use, but you've also demonstrated how to scaffold a discussion into looking at language. So it's an activity that works on lots of different levels. This is just one example. Obviously, we are having to, I've got more I can show you, but time is an issue. So I'm going to move on to talking about materials very quickly. So we need to use materials in our training. We need to use teaching materials, and we want them to be inclusive. But we also need them to reflect what trainees really get to work with. And so when we're talking about supporting trainees with this, it's more about adapting than creating. I would say that there are audits we can do. So this is an audit, again, from that same UNICEF publication I referred to earlier, sorry. And I love this because it has a real focus on what you do after the audit. You'll see that it asks you to look at different things, and there are guidance questions that come with this, and it asks you to make decisions about what you do and how to do it. So we can do this with our own materials that we're bringing into training sessions, but we can also ask our teachers to do this. You'll see there's lots of things. It looks at elements of bias. It looks at also suitabilities of activities. So there are obvious ways we can do this with our trainees. We can ask them to do this with material, or we can ask them to start designing their own materials assessment documents. I still remember a session I went to on assessing materials and analysing materials with Hannah, who also delivers webinars to the British Council, where we got to do this, and it was a really great activity. And we can share with our trainees helpful sites. This is a list of sites where you can find diverse images. Images are the quickest and easiest way to update your material. So these all have free material that has much better gender representation, and also a lot of them have great intersectionality with disability and race, which I think is really important. My final thought on materials is that this is a quote from Luke Meddings in an article, that depending on the course book is not really going to help, and that really we need to be encouraging our teachers to bring in real material. That's hard, but I have an example here, which is an activity I've done with teenagers, looking at graphic novels, very much in the real world for teenagers. And this was something that happened online, where an artist produced an alternate version of a comic or a graphic novel cover with the headline, "Fixed It." So what I would do with this is get my trainees, if we're practicing this in the training room, to give them an example, to look at it and list the differences between the images, which do they prefer, what is the impact, which one do they think is the real published version, and then talk to them about where this comes from, show them the original post on Tumblr, and why this had happened, and ask them, have they come across the term the male gaze before? What's the impact? If they need help understanding it, here are some more social media posts to help them explain and explore real English, real authentic materials. So if we're doing a session on authentic materials with our trainees, why not do this? We're balancing the two needs. We need to train them on authentic materials, but we also need to bring in gender issues. And this activity follows on with looking how the original artist responded. And there are possible outcomes. You know, if we're looking for a productive outcome, maybe we don't take gender as the main issue in the productive outcome. Maybe we do. Lots and lots of different ways that this activity could finish. So if you have trainees who are willing to explore this, this would be a great lesson to demonstrate and get them to unpack and analyse how they could take this technique into the classroom. All right, I'm aware we are practically out of time. So 4 final thoughts. Start with inclusion. Start with making your training room a space where all your trainees are able to participate equally, because if you don't do that, the rest of the training you do is minimised. As above, so below. What I mean is that the training room has to be the model. Demonstrate these practices so that your trainees can absorb them and they will mirror them. Meet your trainees where you are. If your trainees are not able to do that final activity, which is a bit extreme, looking at gender, they can still think about just not using the phrase ladies and gentlemen. Work in their ZPD, work in their zone of proximal development, because all progress is progress. Little steps. All right, here's some recommended reading and resources. Some of these are materials that are designed to promote equality in various aspects. Some of them are reading that might support. I definitely recommend all of them. And again, this list will be available in the PowerPoint when it gets shared. All right, hopefully we've got time to squeeze in a couple more questions. I'm sorry I have gone a little bit over the intended time. I always do because I get passionate and excited.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the great presentation, and many thanks to our colleagues for your active participation. So when you asked the question about how trainees can refer to students, Harris made a very nice suggestion. So using hello colleagues to create rapport and recognize they are becoming part of a community. So we are also here building a community of practice for teacher educators. Laura, for this context, can you share any challenges you have faced as a teacher trainer, teacher educator around gender, and what did you learn from this challenge? Do you remember?
Yes, I mean, it is definitely not without challenge to start raising these topics. It can be uncomfortable for teachers if this is not something that they've been encouraged to explicitly think about before. It requires, as I said, introspection, and that's really hard. You have to be willing, it's a process. This is not a one session and done with your teachers. You have to think about how to build it in gradually, and I hope that some of the activities I showed today can demonstrate that. And you have to be sensitive to cultural issues. You have to be sensitive to things it might bring up in people's history. If you're working with teachers who have been discriminated against, who have faced issues. So I think, I mean, for me, that's all the more reason that we do this, but it's definitely a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. But yeah, it's always good to be aware of all of these challenges. And Francie asked a very good question. Who is responsible to spread gender equality? Is it the educational system, teachers, students' perspectives? And what is the role of teacher educators in this context?
Whose responsibility is it? Humans.
Yes.
It's every single person's responsibility. It's part of being a global citizen. It's part of being a human on this planet. That's my opinion. I think teachers have a really crucial role because we are, like it or not, we're seen as role models. We're seen as having a responsibility in this area. We have a responsibility not just to teach English, and this can be really hard as well for some teachers. I teach English, why do I have to worry about this? But when English is a communication tool, and so thinking about sensitive and inclusive communication fundamentally is part of what we should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. So we hope our colleagues, you found the session useful and picked up useful ideas to reflect on. If you want to find out more about this topic, you can download our publication, Guide for Teacher Educators, Creating an Inclusive Environment. We have a new CPD framework and self-assessment tool for teacher educators. You can find the links in the chat. And the recording of this session and the slides will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. So thank you so much, Laura, for your generosity, for sharing your slides. And the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. And please share your feedback with us. You will see the feedback form in the chat and also in the email that you'll receive. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators. You'll find lots of updates. And finally, register for our next webinar. It's about research. How can teacher educators encourage teachers to engage with research? So we very much hope to see you all again in the future sessions. And thank you so much, Laura, once again. So it's been a very informative and awareness-raising session. So until then, dear colleagues, have a great day and goodbye.